by magic, everybody, the room comes to order. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very, very much for coming along this evening. My name is Maggie Chapman, and the RIC Edinburgh group asked if I would chair this evening. I'm convener of the Scottish Independence Convention and a keen supporter of and activist with RIC, so very, very, very pleased to be here this evening. We're here to talk about the UK in crisis and what is next for the independence movement. We've had quite an extraordinary few days. I'm not going to repeat the Chinese curse of living in interesting times, but, you know, oh well, just done it. A day where, well, the day after the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom lost 11-0 to the Supreme Court, which is rather a nice rather a nice victory for certain people, I think. And that arrogance of him and his government to still be there. I think, you know, in times gone by, if that had happened, they would have been out the door yesterday. We saw, I don't know if anybody was following the resumption of Parliament today. The Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, called Parliament dead and a disgrace. So yeah, I think it says something extraordinary about our politics and our democracy, if you can call it that. And so to lead our discussion this evening, we have David Jamieson. Welcome, thank you for coming along. As many of you will know, David is a journalist with Common Space and has been a keen writer and speaker on all things Brexit and independence for several years now. And so without further ado, over to you.
Thanks very much. Do people mind if I just sit down? Is that all right? I just want to make some sort of quite quick introductory comments and then bring people in for a wider discussion, because I actually think there's a lot to debate. I think that the path to independence is a lot more complex now than it was 5 years ago. What usually gets focused on is that everything that we said about the British state has been fallen out in those last 5 years, especially in the 3.5 years since Brexit. But it's often missed how much more complex independence has become as a result, particularly of the Brexit crisis. I think that there's three essential ways in which it's become much more complicated. The first is that there's no longer an obvious legal route towards securing a legal referendum. Now, well, bar one that I'll go on to. The British state, being in the condition that it currently is, would have to be even more off its rocker than it obviously is to grant a Scottish government a legal referendum in the same way that they did in 2012 with the Edinburgh Agreement. This alone creates huge questions for our movement, because the leadership of the Scottish National Party has ruled out any other method of independence, so any kind of non-recognised referendum like they had in Catalonia, for example, any kind of alternative process like that. I sometimes hear people say, well, if we keep asking for it and keep asking for it, pressure will emerge in the international community, that the British state will be embarrassed by constant demands that are refuted over and over again. I have to say, I can't imagine that anything would embarrass the British state more than it is currently embarrassed. I also hear a theory that they actually want rid of the Scots as a sort of troublesome element. The British state is already a system under huge strain. I don't think it thinks in those terms. I don't think it actually thinks in national terms in that kind of sense. I think that the British state is run by figures who enjoy state power, who enjoy enormous wealth, who enjoy enormous influence on the international stage. They're humiliated by Brexit, which they don't want. I mean, we're talking about the permanent British state. 99 out of 100 FTSE 100 companies do not want to leave the European Union. This is a vital point that has to be remembered, because everything that's happened in the last 3.5 years to try and oppose the Brexit vote will be done to try and oppose Scottish independence. And I'll get onto that in a minute. But yes, that's the pragmatic force that we're up against. A state which in its modern incarnation is hundreds of years old, refuses to allow itself to decline chaotically after the collapse of its empire, is trying to fight its dislocation from the global system in the form of Brexit, and will certainly not be keen on allowing an independence referendum with the relative ease that it did in 2012. The British state has had a terrible shock, a terrible fright that in living memory, none of the state management can remember a crisis quite as bad as this, that has done so much damage to the British state, to the Conservative Party, at least at this point in terms of prestige, if not in terms of damage to the economy and so on. It's now universally accepted in elite circles that David Cameron was trigger happy when it came to referendum, and that he obviously should not have granted the Brexit referendum, but it's now quite often said shouldn't have been going around doing things like 2012 either. I mean, you can imagine had we won in 2014, we now know that decision would have been resisted as well, and it would also have thrown us into a kind of different turmoil. Which brings me on to the second point, what I think has changed, which is, I think a lot of us imagined in the back of our minds, because it wasn't at the forefront of our minds when we were campaigning for a yes vote in 2014, we were mainly thinking about winning that vote. I don't think that very much thought went into what happened once we won. I think Brexit is an object lesson in what happens when you win, which is that it's not over. Let's just say somehow we're able to secure a Section 30 type situation. We go on to win that vote. Let's say the margin is 52-48, and I don't really imagine it would ever be anything greater than that, at least not in the next few coming years. I think the following things would then happen. There would instantly be a campaign launched, backed by millions and millions of pounds, launching a campaign for a people's vote or a confirmatory referendum to decide the final deal that a Scottish government would arrive at with the rest of the UK state. That would be a campaign with unprecedented access to the media. It would be a campaign with unprecedented access to big business, the majority of which would be resisting independence. And the UK state itself would be incentivised to resist any favourable terms of independence. On the basis, of course, that if there were to be some kind of confirmatory vote on a deal, it would suit the rest of the UK state to give us as bad a deal as they possibly could, even if it was one that was damaging to themselves, on the basis that that would undermine the possibility of independence itself. This links, I think, importantly to an issue about the Section 30 order, which is that if what we are still doing is seeking an independence referendum which is recognised by Westminster, one of the conditions in that referendum may well be a confirmatory vote, a final vote on the deal that emerges from negotiations for independence. Now, I know this sounds like I'm erecting a lot of barriers to independence and it sounds daunting, but I also think that for those of us who want independence to be a genuinely transformatory project, this is actually a very exciting development. It tells us what we always argued, that constitutional politics is not just constitutional politics, that it strikes at the heart of societies which are hierarchical and uneven and unequal, that constitutional questions are questions about democracy and about how we organise a society in every way. The 3 years, or probably more, if it turned into an ongoing constitutional battle like Brexit between a yes vote, although of course we don't actually know what the wording would be either, but let's just say it's yes, no for the sake of brevity. A yes vote, it would probably take about 3 years. So that's what it was once believed it would take between a vote for independence and actual independence itself. If we were up against the sort of campaign that I've just outlined, we would have to campaign on an equal and opposite basis, indeed more than equal and opposite, to secure the type of independence that we wanted, and just to secure independence full stop. It would be a non-stop battle between us and the state's ongoing campaign to prevent and deny an independence vote. And actually, for those of us who talk about radical independence or an independent socialist Scotland and so forth, that's an incredibly exciting prospect. Because I think you would naturally have to burst the parameters of civic and democratic life as we currently experience it in Scotland. It would necessitate establishing new institutions, new forms of democratic assembly to debate what we wanted from negotiations with the RUK state. I don't think that's something that could possibly be left in the hands of the Scottish Government. So, in many ways, it actually opens up a lot of opportunities and suggests how potent that movement could be. And I don't think, I think that we have strengths in that sense that, for example, the Leave vote in the UK didn't have. Because most of the mobilising forces on the Leave side of the vote, most of the coordinating and organising forces were moneyed, elite, reactionary. They weren't in a position to engage in a kind of popular democratic politics that really challenges the status quo that I'm discussing. So the third thing that I think has changed, and this leads on from when I'm talking about you would need a mass participatory process to discuss what we wanted out of the negotiations that would lead to independence. There is no longer really a binary yes and no situation. What has been made absolutely clear from the Brexit crisis, and is now unavoidable for our movement, is that we're not discussing yes and no. Just as in Brexit, people weren't really discussing leave and remain. They were discussing sovereignty, which was actually an issue probably not very well addressed in the 2014 referendum. So I think we are confronted immediately in a way that we weren't in the run-up to the 2014 vote. Confronted immediately by the question of what we want from independence, and it's no longer an afterthought. Because it conditions precisely the kind of movement that we have, precisely the kind of arguments we make, and precisely the demands we place on the table in any negotiations. Now, the way the SNP leadership has sought to deal with this in the last couple of years, though they've been partially repudiated by the SNP's membership, is to solve this contradiction by heading in the direction of sort of a kind of ultra-globalisation position. So we resolve the issue of sovereignty just by getting rid of it. You resolve the issue of sovereignty over, for example, the currency. Just give that to, not even the Bank of England, to the London money markets. Just give it to global capitalism. How do we resolve our defence commitments? Just give them to NATO. How do we resolve our trading arrangements, our economic regulation, much else besides? Be completely uncritical of the European Union as an institution. So we're parcelling away sovereignty to London, Washington, Brussels, and hoping that independence is just a changing of the flag. I have to say, I think that's not going to wash. I think people really were, in the 2014 independence referendum, committed to a very simple democratic idea, which is, and often quoted, all of the decisions that affect people who live in Scotland should be made by the people who live in Scotland. I think that's fundamental. In fact, I don't think you have an independence movement without that idea, without that simple democratic idea. And at the moment, there's a leading tendency in the independence movement that says all of the decisions that affect people who live in Scotland should be made elsewhere. They should be made on the London money markets, or in the Pentagon, or in Brussels. And it seems to me that that's a contradiction that is definitely going to collapse. Now, I think that the RIC conference, which people may have seen advertised tonight, is going to be the vital next stop for the independence movement to debate these issues. It's not a debate that's going to be had in Aberdeen at the SNP conference, because all mention of independence has been stricken from the order paper, as it were. It will be the only thing that people are talking about in the pubs and the cafes and everywhere that's not the conference floor, but it won't be discussed at the conference. So I think it's about 10 days after that is the RIC conference in Glasgow. And I think that some very serious debates need to be had about what in particular the radicals and the socialists in the independence movement are demanding. And that has to also include the really simple debates about how we actually get to the point of an independence referendum. I'll offer just a couple of ideas that seem completely obvious to me. One is that the independence movement needs to become a movement willing to engage in direct action, civil disobedience. It needs a mass movement method to extract a referendum in the first place. And that's not an easy thing to have. If you want that on a mass scale, the independence movement will need to change. It will need to grow its influence amongst much wider groups of people in order to have the legitimacy, I think, to campaign on that basis in any kind of serious way. So I think it needs to do that. I'm glad to see figures like George Kerrigan. They've actually been arguing this for a couple of years, seeing what's been going on. I think that's a first step, and I think that we also need to have forums where we discuss what independence is actually for, because whatever ideas about that were arrived at in 2014, I don't think they any longer hold water. I think the world has really changed. The last thing I would say about this is it's not just Britain. Globalisation's in retreat around the world, something that when I got involved in the left 20 years ago, we said we were anti-globalisation. Now that system of affairs is in retreat, and the people forcing the retreat are unfortunately mainly on the right and far right. If we're going to harness that situation in Scotland, because it will come here as well, Scotland won't remain as an island of globalisation in a de-globalising world. I think it's important that we're in a position to harness that energy and make it a progressive movement around Scottish independence. That's me.
Thank you very much.